Welcome to the Author's Attic, a production brought to you by Social Problems, the official journal of SSSP, the Society for the Study of Social Problems. My name is Casey Hendricks, and today I'll be joined by Jennifer Carlson of the University of Toronto to discuss her article entitled Moral Panic, Moral Breach, Bernhard Goetz, George Zimmerman, and Racialized News Reporting in Contested Cases of Self-Defense. Without further ado, please let me welcome Professor Carlson.
So this article is focusing on how the media represents justifiable homicide cases and what we can learn about the racialized construction of crime in the process. So what the article does is look at local newspaper coverage of two sort of flashpoint justifiable homicide cases. One is the Bernhard Goetz case from the 1980s, and I use New York Times newspaper articles for that. And the other is the recent George Zimmerman case, and I use the Orlando Sentinel to look at newspaper representations of that case. And so what I do in the article is try to understand how, there's been many changes in terms of how we think about crime, how we talk about race, or at least how we think about crime and how we think we talk about race. So, for example, the calls for, supposedly a post-racial America after the election of Obama and that sort of thing. And so I wanted to understand how are we talking about race in these kinds of cases differently, and how is it intersecting with crime? And so I used the literature on moral panic to talk about and understand the Bernhard Goetz case. And I argue that actually we need to kind of tweak that a bit to think about George Zimmerman. I propose a concept of moral breach to understand the George Zimmerman coverage. And this kind of gets at the idea that there's a lot more ambivalence in terms of how this case is actually reported, which means on the one hand, there's space for example, Trayvon Martin to be presented as a victim. There's space for African Americans to talk about the quote unquote talk that they have with their children, particularly their boys. But at the same time, it's not as if there is consensus regarding the problem in the same way that there's consensus in a moral panic. So that's in a nutshell what the article is about. My intended audience obviously is largely academic, and anyone really interested in sort of understanding what seems to be somewhat of a paradox. Again, this paradox of, on the one hand, we want to believe that we're able to talk about race in a more socially conscious way, that we're in a, kind of post-racial context, but at the same time, you can just turn on the news or put on your Twitter feed, and it's very clear that race persists as a vector of inequality in a myriad of ways in the US. So anyone who's interested in sort of wrapping their heads around that, that's my intended audience. Like many Americans, I was glued to the internet, to the TV, trying to understand what was going what was happening with the George Zimmerman case, all the way from kind of the unfolding, the breaking of the case, the hearing about an unarmed teenager being shot to death by a neighborhood watch captain, all the way to the lack of police action, to the charges, to the trial, and to the acquittal. And so I was interested. My research focuses on gun politics and mostly looks at people who actually carry guns. And so this was really interesting to me to see how this case was being presented in the media. And so I was motivated just kind of by sheer interest, but I was also motivated intellectually by what I knew already about sort of the social construction of crime. So for example, Catherine Beckett's book on the politics on crime, the research coming out regarding the 1980s and the 1990s and the war on crime, and the moral panic literature. And I, as a criminologist or a sociological criminologist, I knew that things had changed, right? I knew that obviously we know that crime has dropped dramatically since the early 90s. And there's actually now a lot of, thanks to the work of people like Chris Eugen, Michelle Alexander, Jonathan Simon, Louis Fauquon, there's now a kind of almost, a mainstreaming of social critique of the criminal justice system. So I was really interested to see whether how we talk about this kind of justifiable homicide case, if there's actually been a change. But there was a comparison case that I could draw, which actually put me in the heart of the war on crime, in the heart of this sort of this moral panic surrounding crime in Manhattan in the 1980s in New York City. So that was, of course, the Bernhard Goetz case. And I should say also that justifiable homicide cases are particularly interesting case to think through this, because the whole kind of crux of them is not the question of whether a crime was committed, but who is the real victim and who is the real perpetrator. So there can be built-in space for contesting that. And as we see with the George Zimmerman case, there was a lot of contestation about who was the real victim and who was the perpetrator, who is the real criminal. Whereas with Bernard Goetz, there was very little contestation over who was the victim and who was the criminal. My research is really focused on the politics of guns in the contemporary US context. Thanks to the George Zimmerman trial, there's actually the public IQ on gun culture in the US and gun laws in the US has really went up. So in the last several decades, there's been a massive shift toward legal gun carry. So being able to get a license to carry a gun is much more accessible than it was, say, 50 years ago. The last stats that I heard, over 11 million Americans are licensed to carry a gun concealed. And then in addition to that is your stand your ground laws, which pull the castle doctrine out of the house and into the public street, basically. So that also kind of, again, this is all geared at gun use, gun culture centered on self-defense. So this is what some people call gun culture 1 or gun culture 2.0. But it's not your granddad's gun culture, right? It's not hunting centered. It's self-defense centered. It's less rural. It can be rural, but it's also more urban and suburban. And so my research really looks at what caused that transformation and the social impact of that transformation.
You've been watching The Author's Attic. Thanks to our featured guest, Jennifer Carlson. Stay tuned for our next installment. It features Sophia Aptekar of the University of Massachusetts at Boston. She'll be discussing her article entitled Gifts Among Strangers, the Social Organization of Free Cycle Giving. We'll see you then.